Jesus was born entirely naturally. He was conceived like anybody else. It is ironic that those who knew Jesus best and give us the most reliable picture of what he was like, in the end, their mission turns out to be treated as heresy.
Do you regret your own loss of faith?
Oh, yes, it was a sad business, but you have to face what you think is true. The important thing in life is to be honest. These disciples had experiences of seeing Jesus because they were under extreme tension following the events of Holy Week.
Was there a period when you held on to Christian faith while abandoning any belief in physical resurrection?
Oh, yeah. Belief in God doesn't go quickly, and I felt it was quite possible to still believe in God while thinking that you could explain lots of things in the biblical tradition without requiring divine miracle. So far as a Christian is concerned who is committed, shall we say, to belief in God and finds no problem with that, it wouldn't matter ultimately if Jesus didn't rise again from the dead physically. You could believe in God for other reasons. But my own problem, and I think actually the problem of a lot of people, is that the ground shifts from under all the arguments on which one has based one's religious faith, and one is left, as you say, desperately hanging on and trying to hang on to one's faith. And it would be better, in my view, just to face the beastly truth, look it in the eye and say, well, I can't think that anymore.
Good day, my Christian friends, and welcome back to Evangelical Platform, a ministry dedicated to preserving the gospel in a complex, messy, postmodern world. I'm Dr. Frederick Mulder. I came to England several years ago to do a second master's degree on the resurrection of Jesus at Durham University, and then I went to Holland to do my PhD also on the resurrection. I lectured also in England for a few years, and now I'm full-time in this ministry, equipping Christians, challenging them to remain faithful to the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Today we are tackling one of those big controversies in the Church of England over the past half century, and that is Anglican atheism. I'm going to focus in on Michael Goulder. He's one of the most notorious, controversial biblical scholars in England of the past half century. And I think the main reason he got under my skin was because he did what my liberal professors in South Africa wouldn't do. He came to the conclusion that Jesus did not rise bodily from the dead, and then he wrestled with his conscience. And then he resigned and he became an atheist and said, you cannot remain in the church, you can't be a vicar or a professor in the church, not believing in the bodily resurrection of Jesus and remain in the church. You have to resign. And I think that's why I really dug in and started to read everything of Michael Goulder I could get my hands on. Mark Goodacre encouraged me to read his work and I couldn't put it down. And I've got most of his books. I had an interview with his wife, who was an atheist before him. I had an interview with one of his mentors' son in Oxford. So what I want to do today is I want to focus in on two huge controversies that Michael Goulder was involved with. On the one hand, I'm going to focus on his views that the resurrection was a hallucination or it was a conversion vision. And then I'm going to focus in the second part on his quest for honesty and how he eventually resigned. And I'm going to discuss a number of liberal theologians and all of the intrigues behind the scenes. So you are so welcome today to get a pen and paper, get a cup of tea or coffee, make some notes. And this is all research still in process. So you are very welcome to send some feedback when we are done. I will finish, of course, on a positive note, encouraging you Christians. So just a couple of initial observations. Number one, we are going to have to make dozens of videos on the resurrection of Jesus. I've done research for more than 12 years now on it. I've published a number of articles, and this will really just be to whet your appetites for the whole discussion. So this is not going to be a program where we will unpack all the evidence and we will give all the answers. I'm going to focus in on things that I've really found interesting in Michael Goulder, and then I'm going to try and unpack that in a way that will be beneficial and interesting for you as well. So let's start with this view that Goulder articulated, that Paul and Peter and the disciples experienced conversion visions or hallucinations. That is this controversial claim that Goulder put on the table several decades ago. Now, I want to unpack that with biographical information, as I've said. So I'm going to start with his time at Eton. Now, Michael Goulder went to Eton between 1940 and 1946, and he tells us that Eton education was based on two foundations which stood in some tension. One of these was Christianity, but it was a very formalistic, ritualized, traditional high Anglicanism, and it was definitely not evangelical. We're going to come back to that a bit later. And in opposition to this, you had this quest for truth and academic excellence. And the person who instilled this the best in him was his classics tutor called Richard Martineau. And this is what he says. The authors who had the greatest impact on us were Plato and Homer. Plato thought that one should be weary of accepting wisdom and skeptical of anything proclaimed with confidence and authority. And then he says Richard Martineau was an enthusiastic disciple of Plato and of his teacher Socrates. We were constantly urged to think for ourselves. Socrates mattered, Goulder said, because he questioned every orthodoxy. He never took the standard view for an answer. Above all, the search for truth had primacy. Now, this is crucial. That statement goes right through Goulder's work, that quest for truth wherever it leads. And that was instilled profoundly through his tutor, Richard Martineau. Now, after Eton, in 1946, he went to Cambridge University. And there is a very important thing that we learn from his time at Cambridge. He went to Cambridge Intercollegiate Christian Union. He was invited. This was an evangelical Christian organization on campus. And we're going to discover here something about Eton that people will probably glance over. But what is crucial is he was invited by one of his Oxford friends to go to this evangelical meeting. And I need to quote for us to understand the kind of Christianity that he was exposed to at Eaton at the time. Listen to this. I went to the sermon of this KQ meeting, and it was indeed a shock. It was the first time that I had encountered Christianity as a religion of salvation, very different from the pallid gospel of Eaton. KQ speakers spoke seriously. They could persuade the audience that they were in peril of eternal death and that salvation was possible only by conversion. Do you see what's going on here? Michael Goulder tells us that Eaton education, the kind of Christianity they taught, was not about salvation, that we need to be redeemed and we need salvation. We need Christ's substitutionary atonement for our sins. He tells us that he never heard that gospel for 5 years at Eton. He heard it for the first time at Eaton in Cambridge. And can you now see, if you've got a pallid, traditional high church Anglicanism, very formalistic, boring, he uses the word boring at one point, in contrast to this exciting classics tutor and this quest for truth, and you read Homer and Plato, Socrates in the original Greek, and they push you and you explore these insights. Can you see that tension and who usually wins in the end? The exciting bit, that which challenges the status quo. Now, it is important just to mention that at this point, Goulder still believed in the resurrection. We will see that later on in his time in Hong Kong. But he was already exposed to a particular brand and kind of Anglican Christianity and critical scholarship on the other hand. But he still believed in the bodily resurrection of Jesus, as we will see. Then Michael Goulder went to Hong Kong, and in Hong Kong he went to the cathedral. He got bored with his work that he did, and he became friends with the dean and then the bishop, and then they invited him to join the cathedral, and eventually he got ordained. And I want to focus in on two crucial bishops, Bishop R.O. Hall and Bishop E.W. Barnes. Those two bishops, I think, is crucial in understanding Michael Goulder. Bishop Hall was the bishop of Hong Kong, and Goulder refers to him as a saint, and he had a profound impact on him. He was a very pious man, but he was also a theological liberal. And then as he read more than 100 theology books. Before ordination, he says that he learned enough of liberal Anglican theology. And now I think what is crucial to understand is, let's bring this into the resurrection. Bishop R.O. Hall explained to them that he had a vision of Jesus. And I need to read that for us. This man who had this profound impact on Goulder, this is what he described. Bishop Hall told us in a sermon, quote, "I am an apostle because I have seen the Lord," close the quote. He had a vision of Christ alongside him one morning as he celebrated the Eucharist. He ended every interview with prayer, and Bishop R.O.'s prayers were not the embarrassing Christian Union formulas I had so come to loathe. They were utterly sincere, natural and straightforward, and they left you feeling between tears and ecstasy. His influence was irresistible. Can you see what happened here? This bishop that was irresistible for Goulder had a vision of Jesus, and then later on he also put that vision on the same level as Peter and Paul and the apostles. So he claimed to have had a visionary experience of Jesus on the same level as the apostles. And here you have Michael Goulder as a young student sitting at the feet of his Gamaliel. And this is the encounter that he had. Now, he still believed in the bodily resurrection at the time. And how do I know that? I did research and discovered a very profound article he wrote for the Journal of the Cathedral in 1952, in which he took on a liberal in England who denied the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Now, this is crucial, and we have to unpack some of that because it is crucial for the whole later discussion. So while Goulder was still in Hong Kong, there was a liberal Bishop of Birmingham, Ernest William Barnes, who denied the bodily resurrection of Jesus. And at the time, the Archbishop was Archbishop Fisher, who openly criticized him for this view. He spiritualized the resurrection in a book called The Rise of Christianity, published in 1947. So Archbishop Fisher rejected Barnes's theories, stating that he reduced the resurrection of our Lord to a subjective conviction on the part of his disciples. So this suggests that it was a conversion, vision, or hallucination, subjective experiences. Archbishop Fisher noted further that a bishop has stricter standards applied to him and that he must adequately and faithfully express the general doctrines of the Church and their scriptural basis, which he pledged by his office to defend and promote. Archbishop Fisher concluded that had he held the views espoused by Bishop Barnes, he would not feel that he could continue holding episcopal office in the Church of England. So can you see what's going on here? Michael Goulder wrote a defense of the bodily resurrection of Jesus against the Bishop of Birmingham and challenged him to be honest and resign. But Bishop Barnes refused to resign. Now, as I said, this 1952 article of Goulder is so remarkable because I couldn't find a trace of it in any of his later liberal theories on the resurrection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reserve one or two beautiful quotes from this article for our conclusion at the end. As we move to Oxford, the dean at the cathedral in Hong Kong suggested that Goulder should go back to Oxford to get theological training. And who did he study with? Professor Austin Farrer, who was the tutor for Dean Alaric of Hong Kong Cathedral as well. And Austin Farrer was the second profound influence on Goulder. Austin Farrer was also friends with C.S. Lewis. That's a very interesting research project because there's some complexities in that discussion as well. But Austin Farrer had a profound psychological impact on Michael Goulder, so much so that other scholars recognized that as well. So on page 17, Goulder writes, "I went on to Trinity to meet Austin Farrer, who immediately impressed me with his learning and religious devotion." And later on he says, "It was easy to be over-impressed by Austin. I found his book, A Study in St. Mark and a Rebirth of Images, intoxicating. And in the end, this was too much of a good thing." So he was intoxicated by the scholarship of Farrer. Now, let's move to the resurrection. I attended a special conference in Oxford a few years ago commemorating the life and scholarship of Farrer, and there some of the people who were students of him confirmed that he regarded the empty tomb traditions as later legendary developments. He did not believe that those appearances go back to the early gospel. And then I also discovered that Michael Goulder published an article a number of years later called The Empty Tomb, and there's a very crucial footnote where he says that most of the research in that article goes back to work that Austin Farrer did, and he uses the phrase midrashic, and that refers to Old Testament stories that is adapted in the New Testament, trying to pretend it's history, but it's not. They just copied it from the Old Testament, and that is midrashic. So Michael Goulder published that article several years later with a footnote referring to Austin Farrer. So his second great mentor, Professor Austin Farrer, who had a great piety and a great impact on his life, did not believe in the credibility of the empty tomb traditions. And he was this profound influence on Michael Goulder. After that, He tells us that he read a book on psychology and the resurrection called Battle for the Mind, published in 1957, and then he came to the conclusion that the resurrection appearances were conversion visions or hallucinations, and now he started to articulate that view quite forcefully, countering what he himself wrote in 1952. Now, let's just wrap up this first section. The controversial question I want to ask is whether Michael Goulder was not himself psychologically influenced by Austin Farrer, by Bishop R.O. Hall, who had a vision of Jesus. And when he read this book, Battle for the Mind, and this conversion experiences, that it actually reflected the mentors that he had, and that all of that combined brought him to this point of arguing that it must have been conversion experiences. Now, this is experimental, but I'm asking the question whether Michael Goulder was not psychologically impacted by his mentors. Now, let's just say one or two things. As I said, I'm not going to unpack the evidence against Michael Goulder. You can read N.T. Wright. In 2006, Goulder replied to his thick book on the resurrection. N.T. Wright replied. There's some good counter arguments there. I will put that in the description, but that is not the main focus today. But I hope this gives us a very interesting angle at looking at the scholarship of Michael Goulder on the resurrection and the biographical background of that. I think helps us to understand some of his views from a different angle.
It wouldn't matter ultimately if Jesus didn't rise again from the dead physically. My own problem, and I think actually the problem of a lot of people, is that the ground shifts from under all the arguments on which one has based one's religious faith, and one is left, as you say, desperately hanging on and trying to hang on to one's faith. And it would be better, in my view, just to face the beastly truth, look it in the eye and say, well, I can't think that anymore. I'd rather be straightforward in what I say and communicate to others. At least I found that an enormous relief.
So let's move on to the second section, focusing on honesty. Michael Goulder, who wrestled with his conscience, he became an atheist, he rejected the resurrection, and he resigned his orders as an Anglican priest. And there are going to be a number of fascinating stories in here, culminating with Goulder's wife, who's going to talk about a fudge which some of these liberals concocted to remain in the church while they do not believe in the resurrection of Jesus. So let's start with this whole quest for honesty of Michael Goulder. Now, we need to start in 1968, and that was when the Doctrine Commission came together to work through some of the key controversies in the church, the 39 articles, and they had to try and find a compromise. And we're going to talk about that fudge a bit later on. And on that commission, you had some of the giant liberal theologians of the time. Let's just name a few. We're going to say a few things about each one of them. Maurice Wiles from Oxford. He was an ordained vicar in the Church of England. He rejected the miracles of Jesus. He rejected the divinity of Jesus Christ. John Austin Baker, he was referred to as a liberal theologian who could write like an angel, and he was a crucial figure on the Doctrine Commission. Professor Dennis Nynam, now he was at loggerheads with Michael Goulder a number of times. They were not bedfellows. He was doing form criticism in biblical scholarship. Michael Goulder was part of the Austin Farrer group who rejected form criticism. But it's more than that. There was also, some kind of antagonism between them. And you're going to understand why a bit later when Claire Goulder is going to talk to us about Dennis Nynam and his relationship with Michael Goulder. And then we had Bishop Hugh Montefiore. Now he's crucial on the Doctrine Commission because he was controversial in refusing to subscribe to the 39 articles. I have to read for us an excerpt from that whole journey that he went through to describe what actually happened on the Doctrine Commission that planted the seeds that caused this quest for honesty in Michael Goulder. So let's read an excerpt from Hugh Montefiore to describe how the Doctrine Commission altered and adapted the 39 articles of the Christian faith. When he had to be ordained, his integrity revolted against the thought of subscribing to all the 39 articles. And then he says, quote, "I hit on the compromise of a supplementary declaration. I did that which was prescribed by law, and then I went on to affirm that in making this declaration, I was not subscribing to each and every article, but affirming that they were agreeable to the Word of God at the time in which they were written." There is a certain cultural relativity about all doctrine. We cannot be expected to believe all the same things in exactly the same way as people did in the 17th century. And then he mentions how he was then handpicked to serve on the Doctrine Commission given his controversial views, and of course it was in the media, and then they had to work on the Declaration of Assent that every vicar must subscribe to in order to be ordained. And this is what he says: "Our first task was to reconsider the Declaration of Assent to the 39 articles. We tried and rejected various possibilities, such as writing fresh articles for today, or scrapping all mention of the articles. Now, since the Commission comprised representatives of different shades of the Church of England, it seemed that we were in an impasse when we retired for the night after several meetings. But next morning, crucially, John Austin Baker, Bishop of Salisbury, pulled out of his hat a formula on which we could all agree. This is embodied in the present Declaration of Assent, which consists of neither assent to each and every article, nor of a general assent to them all. We affirm our loyalty to our inheritance of faith as our inspiration and guidance under God, and to the faith to which the historic formulae bear witness." Now, the bear witness was crucial, because that provided the hermeneutical relativity that conservatives and liberals could say those words while meaning radically different things with it. We will see that in a bit more detail later. So this is what happened on the Doctrine Commission. They altered the Declaration of Assent in a way that liberals could deny key doctrines and get away with it. So how do we know these claims are accurate or credible? There are a number of test cases we can look at, but I want to focus on the Myth of God Incarnate, published in 1977. It created a storm in England, more than 40,000 books were sold. There was a follow-on book, and there were mainly two reactions. The one group said that these theologians should all resign, and then there was a group that said no, they should remain. And somebody who spearheaded that group was Bishop of Birmingham, Hugh Montefiore. He wanted Michael Goulder, who renounced the atonement, the incarnation, the bodily resurrection in this book. Hugh Montefiore wanted him to remain in the church. Why? I think the Doctrine Commission report made provision for liberals to deny the bodily resurrection of Jesus and yet remain in the church. What happened at General Synod? You had Professor Geoffrey Lamb. He was Canon of Ely and Professor of Divinity at Cambridge. He already renounced the empty tomb traditions as myth on a BBC program earlier. He intervened and had a genius plan averting censure of this book at General Synod. So what you have is you had liberals like Lump, Montefiore, Nineham, Baker, Wiles, who wanted liberals who deny, for instance, the bodily resurrection to remain in the church. They wanted to recalibrate the Christian church. They wanted to change or alter the meaning of words to accommodate these liberals. And that brings us to this quest for honesty of Michael Goulder. Michael Goulder wrestled with his conscience. And the whole thing came to a point when he gave talks in Hong Kong. They invited him back to give some special lectures, and there he was challenged. And I need to read that for you and me so that we can really get a sense and a feel of what was the atmosphere like and how he eventually came to that famous resignation. Let's listen to this. I felt increasingly the contradiction between what I was saying in this course and, on so frail a creedal basis, to be encouraging young people in their training for the ministry. Matters came to a head with a question session after the last public lecture. My friend Philip Shen, a lecturer in theology in the Chinese university, said, "The critique of Christian doctrine has been very sharp, but the defense has been rather weak. How long do you think the church can continue in this situation?" Philip later assured me that he meant the question exactly as posed, but at the time I felt it as questioning my sincerity. How long could I continue in this contradiction? Over the next weeks, I began to feel that my integrity was involved, and the only proper thing was to take action and resign my orders. In the days when I was at Westcott House is a liberal Anglo-Catholic college in Cambridge where many liberals went to. In the days when I was at Westcott House, I had been taught by Hugh Montefiore. He had advised me to read his book on the subject, but unfortunately I had not found it convincing. I could not escape from the dilemma. It seemed impossible to think that God was providentially guiding all human affairs. But the alternative offered by John Heck was to believe in God because of our experience of him, and I had had no such experience. At this point, on my return from Hong Kong, I received a postcard from Dennis Nynham. Now remember, Dennis Nynham and him, they were at loggerheads quite often. Dennis Nynham was a liberal. He did not believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. He made the work of Rudolf Bultmann, very famous in England. So he got a card from Dennis Nynham, which read, quote, "I understand that you are having doubts about your belief. You may like to know that I think that if you were to resign your orders, almost everyone would approve. I wrote to you to resign my orders as an Anglican priest in September 1981, and he was most understanding. In part, I felt better, having taken what seemed to me an honourable course of action." So what we have here is you have Michael Goulder, who rejected the evidence for the resurrection. He denied the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and eventually he was challenged, and it boiled down to honesty for him. And he came to the conclusion that if Jesus didn't literally rise from the dead, you can't remain a vicar or a professor in the church. If Jesus didn't literally rise from the dead, then you can become an atheist. That is basically what it boils down to. It came down to honesty. Now, before we get to Michael Goulder's wife, who famously spoke about a fudge that the liberals created, we first just quickly need to go to Gerald Bray. Is probably the number one church historian in the Church of England, and he wrote a book on heresy. And I think in these two paragraphs, Gerald summarizes the current scenario quite well, where he writes the following. What we now have is a church where people who deny almost every major Christian doctrine prance about in pseudo-medieval costume, claiming to be bishops in the Church of God, merely because the right people have laid hands on them in canonically approved ceremonies. For 2 or 3 generations now, liberal Catholics within the Anglican fold have been progressively hollowing out its doctrine whilst at the same time insisting on its ceremonies. It would be hard to find anyone who has been denied ordination for failing to believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus, but many ordinands can testify to the problems they have had with their bishops when they have refused to wear a stole, as if the piece of cloth around their necks was more important than those left behind in the empty tomb. And this was already written in 2009, summarizing the doctrinal chaos that developed since 1968. And this can be confirmed in 2019 when the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, appointed Dr. John Shepherd from Australia, who denies the physicality of the resurrection of Jesus, to be the representative at the Vatican. Now this brings us then to this fudge that atheist Claire Goulder, the wife of Michael Goulder, referred to in my interview with her. I spoke to her about Dennis Nynam, who basically encouraged Michael Goulder to resign. I wanted really to understand why would he do that. Others wanted him to stay. Dennis Nynam almost encouraged him to resign. So let me read from her written response. This is what she said. I quote, "I don't know why Dennis Nynam encouraged Michael to resign his orders. He himself didn't really believe any more than Michael did, but preferred to stay within the church. How threatening Michael's declared views and decision to leave the church may have been to Dennis, I don't know. I think that Dennis liked to take a superior stance, and in his unasked for preface to Michael's festschrift, he says some unwarranted and not friendly things about him, which later, when I challenged them, he said were written only in jest. But people reading it would not know it was a joke, and I don't think that Dennis didn't mean it anyway. Now, Michael would not quarrel with anyone, but I have always felt sore about this matter. They were very unhappy about the way Dennis Nynam went about all these things. And now this is the crucial bit. This is now, what I want to try to really hammer in for evangelical Christians to understand. Claire Goulder says the following to me. You, Frederick, may be right that Michael's open honesty and clarity of thought did pose a challenge to people who preferred to fudge their position. Michael Goulder realized if Jesus did not literally rise from the dead, if the tomb is not empty, then you have to resign your orders. If the tomb is not empty, then there's no Christianity. And the irony is that the liberals on the Doctrine Commission wanted to remain in the church while denying the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Michael Goulder says you can't do that. It's dishonest. Now let's conclude and wrap up today and finish with some positive good news. So in the first part, I analyzed Goulder's view that the resurrection was a hallucination or a conversion experience. I tried to explore some remarkable biographical information about people who had a great impact on him, who were liberals, who denied the empty tomb, who had visionary experiences, and I want to suggest that that had a psychological impact on his understanding. Secondly, we looked at honesty, and where Goulder challenges the liberals, and he wants to basically say that they are inconsistent, that they are actually dishonest. And this brings us then now to the conclusion. And I'm going to read a section from that article that Goulder published in 1952 in Hong Kong that you don't find a trace of in any of his other scholarship, where he actually took on that hallucination theory against Bishop Barnes from Birmingham, which he argued was dishonest in not resigning from the church. So I'm going to quote a few paragraphs from there, and then I will finish with one verse from the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. So in that article that Goulder wrote and challenged that bishop, the claim of hallucination went like this. It is not necessary to suppose that they were deceivers, but only that they were deceived. The women especially were in a very tense state, and the empty tomb may well have been a hallucination, if not a mistake. Once the story spread, autosuggestions would account for the appearances of the risen Christ, for excited people easily see what they are expecting to see. So here, Goulder summarized this hallucination or mass ecstasy or conversion, visionary experiences that he's going to argue against now. And this is now how he responded to counter this. All four Gospels make it perfectly clear that in fact the resurrection was the last thing that the disciples were expecting. 3 times on the road, Jesus told them he was going up to Jerusalem to be crucified and to rise again. And none of them had a glimmer of understanding what he meant. When the crisis came, they all ran away. From motives of fear or shame, none but John and the woman were at the foot of the cross. And John and Peter were at home when the woman came running back from the tomb. Nor is it reasonable to suppose that Mary was deceived into thinking she had seen Jesus when she thought right up to the last moment that he was the gardener. And then in the last paragraph he talks about the most cogent argument for the resurrection. Listen to this. The most cogent proof that the church has to offer is in its own existence. On Good Friday the disciples were disgraced, disillusioned, and a spiritless lot of cowards. On Pentecost, 7 weeks later, they proclaimed the gospel that God has raised Christ from the dead. For this proclamation, most of the leaders suffered death 2,000 years later, in the face of all that passionate and dispassionate criticism has been able to say. They are still able to persuade 1/5 of the inhabitants of the world that this story is true. Michael Goulder in 1952. Let's finish with 1 Corinthians 15, verse 32. The Apostle Paul says, "If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." Paul is saying, Michael Goulder is saying, if Christ did not literally rise from the dead, let's become atheists. Michael Goulder challenges us to be honest. Can I challenge you to leave a liberal church where they have created a fudge of liberals who deny the bodily resurrection of Jesus but still want to remain in the church? Michael Goulder, I think, helps us to clarify this issue. And Paul actually agrees, if there is no resurrection, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. My friends, thank you for watching today. There's so much more still to be said. I appreciate your patience. Thank you for the comments. Please make contact, and may the Lord Jesus Christ bless you. Have a wonderful week. Goodbye.